If you're in a relationship where you're impacted because one of you has childhood trauma and you've considered couples therapy, maybe you've even tried couples therapy, but perhaps you've quit because one of you felt blamed or one or the other of you left therapy sessions always feeling unheard, then this is the video for you. Hi, I'm Tamara, the therapist that's been there, and I want to talk to you about my style of doing therapy with couples who have childhood trauma that interferes with their relationship. So if one of you has childhood trauma, there's a likelihood that you're both feeling traumatized, and as you try to work through it and try to talk about it, you feel blamed. Relationships that are impacted by childhood trauma often, though we have difficulty with communication in most relationships, it's usually amplified in relationships where there's trauma. And the difficulties with communication will often lead to hidden resentments and disappointments where you're not feeling like you can talk about those things, but they're under the surface, making things feel worse. But you don't want to mention it because you're worried about how your partner will react. Or you could experience you or your partner angry outbursts where you feel misunderstood and you have trouble really articulating what it is that you're feeling or feeling heard about your feelings. So the next thing that you do, whether you feel blamed or you feel like you're the victim in the situation, is that you escalate your communication into anger. There could also be addiction in your relationship. But one thing's for sure, you have a profound sense of disconnection with this person who you deeply love and who you at one time felt really, really connected to. So I want to talk to you about that because you need a therapist who's really knowledgeable about healing childhood trauma. They have to have knowledge about the impact that the trauma has on each of you individually, as well as the impact it has as you interact with each other as part of a system. What I want to tell you at this point in time is that traditionally trained therapists usually are taught that the client in couples therapy is the relationship. So couples therapists are often reluctant to treat individual issues, even though there's no avoiding trauma responses in relationships where there is childhood trauma for one or both of you. And you have to look at those individual issues inside the context of the relationship for relationship therapy to be successful. But typically what therapists will do is they will refer out for the individual issues and then just try to work with the relationship. The reason that fails is because it's already enough that you're inviting a stranger into your relationship who has their own trauma reactions and their own biases about who may or may not be wrong in each situation that they hear that comes across their therapy room couch. But also, they have their own traumas, their own potentially unresolved issues that could bias the work they're doing with you, especially if your unseen or unidentified trauma responses trigger theirs. And that can happen. It happens so much in relationships where there is childhood trauma that you don't even know it. That's the thing about childhood trauma. When we are triggered, we don't usually know that we're triggered. So you need somebody who can look at what's happening and recognize your trauma responses and say, hey, this is a trauma response. And when this trauma response shows up in your relationship, here's what you do about it. The problem is that in therapy school, when therapists are taught that the client is the relationship, individual therapists are also so overwhelmed in grad school that they're not encouraged to focus on healing their own traumas and maintaining a balance between their own mental health and what they're trying to do for other people, let alone individual therapists trying to consult with a couples therapist so that everybody can stay on the same page. You need a therapist who can support individual growth for each partner so that you both have healthy development, and that leads to healing the relationship at the same time. So that said, I'll tell you that I break one of the unwritten rules about how therapists should do therapy with couples. Because I understand that trauma responses will show up for you unannounced, and if nobody recognizes them, then those same trauma responses will undermine the therapists, each one of you individually, and your relationship process in couples therapy. Here's what I do separately. And listen to what it is that you say about your relationship, and listen to your history so I can hear the trauma responses. And then I'll help you individually understand what's happening for you when you're having your trauma responses and how that interacts with your partner's trauma responses. Because the truth is, your trauma responses and your partner's trauma responses are yin and yang in your relationship. They're interlinked. And until you understand that and you can see it very, very clearly, then couples therapy or trying to talk with your partner in off times when you're not in couples therapy becomes very frustrated, because you can end up both feeling triggered while you think it's the other person who's doing something wrong, but it's your trauma responses you have to look at. So working with me, I'm going to focus on increasing your individual awareness of your own trauma responses and your awareness of your partner's trauma responses, and understand why the triggering is happening so I can help each partner heal themselves. The most healthy relationships are where we each know what to do to manage our own responses and therefore are able to respond in a very open, curious way when our partner is having a trauma response. And when you can each stay in your own lane in terms of your own self-management and managing your own trauma responses, then it's so much easier to connect with your partner. Sometimes we need to do separate EMDR sessions so that the hottest triggers that you have between the two of you, you can start connecting back to older traumas instead of blaming your partner. So we do that separately until such time that the relationship feels safe enough that we can sit together in the same session, both partners with me, your therapist, and then we can talk about what's actually happening. We can talk about any bumps in the road that are not being cleared up by understanding your own trauma responses, and teach you how to communicate in a way that doesn't allow any of these trauma responses to hijack your relationship ever again. So what makes this kind of process successful for couples who are managing childhood trauma within the context of relationship? You both have to be willing to consider the possibility that your trauma brain may be interfering with the interactions that you're having with your partner. Remember, I said that the worst part of having childhood trauma is that when we're in trauma responses, we don't know it. And when that's inside a relationship, how that translates is something's happening to me, I'm not happy with what's going on with my partner, and it's their fault. Instead of something's happening with me, I'm not happy, wait, does this feel familiar to something that's old? Am I having a trauma response, or is this really something about my partner? One of the keys is that if you're in a trauma response, then you're less likely to say to your partner, you know, when you did that thing, I felt, fill in the blank, scared, worried that you don't love me, and I would really prefer that we could talk through it so that we can both feel better. No, when you're in a trauma response, there tends to be blaming language, and there tends to be extreme language like, you always do this, you never think of me. So that's one of the clues to know that you're in a trauma response. And I'll teach you how to know that about your own trauma responses so that you'll be familiar enough with them that they take over less often. And then the last thing that leads to success is that both partners have to be willing to acknowledge that maybe the way that you've always done things or the way you've imagined things should always be done maybe isn't the best way for you in your relationship. So you have to be open to change, both of you. And you have to both be willing to consider the possibility that maybe what you've tried so far isn't the right way. So I am licensed in California and Utah now, and I take Aetna and Optum insurance. And if you have a PPO insurance and you're not covered by Aetna or Optum, I also am happy to bill for you so that insurance will reimburse you in the shortest period of time. So if you're interested in working with me to help heal your relationship, then look in the description underneath this video for contact information. I'd love to hear from you. I'll see you next time.